and their reputation's on the line as well. Again, we're dealing with extremely successful, intelligent human beings, but their expertise just lies in a different way of doing business.
Welcome to the Culture Edge podcast. Are you an entrepreneur or a change maker who's frustrated with the pace of change inside your organisation? Well, this show will, I hope, offer you valuable practical advice as you navigate your career. And our guests will also help you answer the question, am I better matched to the corporate world or to the startup world? My name is Stephen Parkins, and I'm determined to help people like you and your business build a strong, healthy culture of innovation. I'd like to welcome Becky Downing today. Becky's been an entrepreneur, a founder CEO, and she's an expert in corporate innovation and venture building. Most recently, her focus has been on organizational design and creating a culture of innovation. If you're a corporate leader or aspiring leader with the ambition to drive meaningful innovation at your company, well, Becky has some great tips for you. Hi, Becky. Welcome to the Culture Edge podcast. Thanks for joining us here today.
Thank you very much for having me.
We're also joined by David, of course.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for having me too.
Just to reiterate the purpose of this podcast, we're focusing on entrepreneurial minds. And I've seen many entrepreneurial minds in the corporate world, as well as, of course, in the startup world. And I've often wondered where they're likely to feel most fulfilled. Now, the way I see it, Becky, is that corporations have some huge advantages, be it the brand, distribution channels. What do you think? What do you see as the ideal home for an entrepreneurial mind?
I'm not sure it necessarily comes down to environment as much as mindset. So, the corporate advantage that you mentioned, of course, having an established brand and reputation, more budget and people, etc., should, in theory, provide corporate advantage. But quite often that can end up being the opposite. And when you're an entrepreneur in the wild, you're having to deal with scarce resources, right? And that actually can really sharpen your thinking. It means you have to ruthlessly prioritize. You have to really focus on, it's a very overused concept now, but the Pareto's law of focusing on the 20% that drives the 80%. And you end up with the same, if not better results, right? Then the problem, I think, with having too much time and resources and budget is the more you spend time, researching, doing customer discovery, customer validation, etc., you quite often end up with more questions than answers. And, I don't think there's any coincidence that I'd say probably, I don't know what the official statistic is, it's certainly over 90%, but I think it's probably like 99% of all business plans never see the light of day as a result of this phenomenon.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me as a stat. So could corporates not just cut the budgets that they provide to these projects? Isn't it that simple? If they've got too much money, well, just treat them like a startup and make the resources scarce?
Well, there is an argument to suggest that might work, but I'm not sure that is necessarily the whole story, right? So a lot of it comes down to, with too much time and overthinking, it allows for fear to creep in as well. So I think you also need to address the overall fear issue, which is a very human thing, particularly when it comes to corporates. One of the advantages you mentioned was brand and reputation, right? And so in theory, that should help accelerate any new fledgling venture. But naturally, corporates also want to protect their brand and reputation. And so, they might hold back on launching to protect that. But, the obvious answer to that is just don't attach your brand or to a fledgling venture. Pushback that I've had to that previously is, well, why would we do that? Isn't the whole point that, where this venture is going to be so much more likely to be successful because we are attaching our brand to it? And it's like, well, it needs to stand on its own 2 feet. Right. So I know this is a horrible analogy. I can't believe I'm about to use it. And hopefully I'm not saying anything wrong, but it's like you can't polish a turd, right? So you can't add a nice brand to something that isn't working and expect it to work. It needs to be able to stand on its own 2 feet and satisfy a customer need. And then you can add the brand to it in the future. So there's kind of a lot of fears that need to be overcome. The most common one, I think, is as a corporate venture builder, you have an exec board to answer to. And the exec board consists of very intelligent and experienced people, but usually their expertise is in business as usual, not so much in early stage startups. And their reputation's on the line as well, right? So that, from their perspective, it's less risky to kind of send you back to the drawing board, do some more research, do some more customer validation, etc., rather than kind of green lighting it and risk it being a failure. Yeah, I think that is probably one of the biggest hurdles that corporate venture builders have to overcome. So yeah, and then there's one that I suppose isn't exclusive to corporates, but whether you build a venture in the wild or within a corporate, and that is fear of rejection, which is a fear of negative customer responses. But intrinsic in that is the assumption that if I don't like the product or yet, then others won't, right? So then what happens is that more time gets invested in making the product better. And so there's also now a newer concept, which is minimum lovable product, which I'm a little bit skeptical about, because what's lovable to me isn't necessarily what's lovable to you, right? So there's huge amount of subjectivity involved in that. And again, really the best thing to do is just get out of your ivory towers, get it to the market, and really open yourself up to the whole array of customer feedback, good, mediocre, and negative, and put yourself in and this is a topic I talk about a lot, which is rapid experimentation. You've got to put yourself in the position where you can gather the feedback and iterate really quickly based on that customer feedback. That way you're not losing potential customers forever. Those are kind of the most common fears that need to be overcome.
Going back to those fears then, do you think then that by moving to the startup world, from the perspective of an individual, those fears go away? Does it then become possible to realize all these things if only you leave the corporate world and go start up your own thing or join an established startup?
No, those fears still exist, but you just have more space and freedom to learn, or fail. You're not kind of being watched by, every step of the way isn't being monitored by an exec board or the structure that you're working from within, right? So obviously, as soon as you raise money, you do have to account to your investors, but generally speaking, startup investors are experienced and they'll invest in you, but they'll only invest in you if they believe in the team. They're more likely to trust the team to get on with it. They've got the risk element built in, so they'll invest in you in the belief that they believe that you have a big potential to provide them with the financial returns that they need to obtain. But equally, they're completely aware that you could be 9 out of the 10 that they invest in that will fail. Right. And it's the 1 in the 10 that will become a unicorn and will provide the returns. And that's how the model works. But that's usually not the model that a typical corporate venture builder follows.
To summarize, if I've understood you correctly, the root cause then in the corporate side is a lack of venture capital style skills, would you say? Is it more down to a lack of understanding, skills, maturity?
Yeah,
or
it's an understanding of, first of all, the information that is important or isn't important when it comes to going to market in the first place. So if it's just a question of funding a business plan, but most investors will require you to have achieved some traction. And by some traction, it means some exposure to the market. And this is a thing that always makes me smile when we talk about customer validation discovery. It's like, well, let's go back to the original definition of customer, right? So like a simple search of Google says, customer is a person who buys goods or services from a shop or business. So there has to be transaction there. There's the parting of money there. And before that happens, customers are only really prospective. People who you're guessing might be your customers. So a lot of corporate venture builders will say we're being hugely customer centric because we're doing design thinking, we're doing service design, we're really thinking about the prospective customers, but ultimately they are not customers, right? So go back to your original question, startups will have had some exposure and market feedback already. And also those investors have a better understanding of the process that ventures go through in order to get to product market fit. So, and by that, I mean, obviously the kind of feedback loops and the constant iteration that goes on in order to get to a repeatable, scalable business model. So they won't ask you for 100-page business plans. In fact, they will require you to stick to 10-page deck. If you can't explain it in 10 slides, then generally speaking, they're not interested. So it's just a totally different way of seeing things and understanding things. And that's because they understand that it's still a massive experiment. It's still unproven. It's just all pie in the sky. So you can spend as long as you want, researching market. Quite often the market doesn't even exist. We're talking about a totally new business model, for instance. The Mintel report doesn't exist. But ultimately, all that matters is getting feedback from real customers in the market as quickly as possible.
And one thing that I think has been sort of put on a pedestal is you shouldn't ask your customers, and the success of that as Steve Jobs not asking customers what they wanted for the iPhone. But obviously that's got massive survivor bias. In your experience, do you think asking customers is the best way to proceed or not? Do people sometimes not actually know what they want until they see it?
Yeah, that's the old Ford quote, isn't it? If I'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. Yeah, it's one of my favorites, very true. But what I think he meant by that is, again, customers who are not buying your product or service aren't customers. They're just people that you're asking an opinion from. So, unless they're actually parting with the money saying, hey, this is really going to help solve my problem, they're not really customers. So you're not really. And actually what they're saying is we don't over-index on, or there is a point of diminishing returns when it comes to gathering customer feedback before we go to market. And that's like when you look at iPhone as an example, an iPhone will launch and it will be completely imperfect and buggy and glitchy. And we completely accept that these days. And we know there's going to be updates to the software. We know there are going to be updates to the hardware. And that happens whilst the product's already in the market. And it very heavily relies on actual customers to provide the feedback that they need to understand where the problems are in the first place.
Yeah, and then you have, say, the Amazon Fire Phone, which came out and died a quick death, which, again, it took on the feedback and they acted upon it. And I think I like Amazon as an example. People who are happy to take those chances, try it, see if it works, rather than maybe dither and do too much testing.
You're listening to the Culture Edge podcast. If you care about innovation and you want practical lessons for your career, you're in a great place with our entrepreneurially minded guests. Subscribe and be the first to know each time we release a new episode.
Absolutely. And I don't see that as failure. And a lot of people will characterize that as, well, what a gigantic flop or failure. And it will probably have received a lot of really negative press. But look, the reality is there's nothing wrong with killing a project early when the feedback suggests that you should do that.
And from your experience, Becky, I mean, you've detailed a lot of issues that can go wrong. Have you seen some positive examples in the corporate world where the attitudes that you're mentioning have been applied the right way and there has been progress made on innovative projects and ventures?
Absolutely. And the common thread there is the corporate venture builders are given a certain amount of space. So I don't like using the word sandbox because it implies that we're playing around, right? It's space and budget, be it anywhere from 1 million or 10 million, whatever the risk appetite of the company is, to engage in a rapid experimentation. And corporates who embrace rapid experimentation are more likely to get to a venture or arrive at a venture model that works quicker. And yeah, that's where I've seen it be successful.
And what would you say are the lessons that can be carried across from those companies that have done it well? I mean, I get the general principles, of course, but when it comes to work on the ground, it seems to be very difficult for some of these organizations to implement those best practices around experimentation. What do you think it is that's holding them back from implementing these fairly well advertised good practices?
Well, first of all, you need good leadership around that. So, and from the mothership. it needs to, like, so the exec team within the mothership needs to be aligned with the venture building unit. It needs to be seen as, imperative importance that, for the company's not just survival, but to win in the long run, to be creating new value pools in addition to incrementally improving on and growing the existing core business. So leadership is critically important. If that's not there, then it just isn't going to happen. Then, as I mentioned, creating that space and budget. And then thirdly, and I've learned this really the hard way as well, through trial and error, is stakeholder management or engagement. So there is an element of education there as well. And that's not meant to sound patronizing, but again, we're dealing within the mothership with extremely successful, intelligent human beings, but their expertise just lies in a different way of doing business. And so it's about bringing them along on that journey, explaining to them why, we're doing things slightly differently and why it's a different paradigm or a different system and why it matters is really important. And then trying to find advocates within the business as well, right? That will help propel things along. Bringing people out, like where I've seen it not work, for instance, as well, is you can have like a leader within the mothership who very much believes in it, and then we'll ensure there's enough budget and we'll give space to the venture building unit to build the new. But then there's too much separation between the venture building unit and the core business. So then what happens is it becomes a bit of an us and them. People in the core business don't understand what the kind of the new business builders are doing. There's no alignment, and then you'll get to a tricky situation in the economy. And what's the first budget that's going to get cut? It's the nice to have. It's the what it's not nice to have, but it's what is considered to be the nice to have, which is innovation, venture building, etc. So
and things that don't produce immediate return results. On investment, right? So yeah, I have to agree with you in terms of the art then of getting that connection right. And it seems that if you're too close to the core and to the mothership, then that limits how radical is your innovation going to be. There's going to be a limit to how far flung these new business models are going to be. On the other hand, if you drift too far away, then you're not part of the company anymore and you lose that bridge. Have you found through your own practice and your own advice that you give to companies, is there a way that they can gauge that? And how would you recommend that a company finds that ideal distance between the innovation unit and the mothership?
Yeah, it's about getting the foundations right as well. And it sounds really kind of ambiguous, creating a culture of innovation, and it often is an ongoing process, but the foundations need to be there, right? The mentality needs to be there. That's one, getting the right structure in place so that, a startup environment can be reproduced to a certain extent. And then ensuring that everything comes down to communication at the end of the day, that the communication lines that are correct so that the mothership not only understands, what the venture building unit is doing, but is also engaged, whether, it's seconding talent into the venture building units as well, so they get experience there and vice versa. So there's kind of like the right amount of cross-pollination without then kind of falling foul of the phenomenon that I meant, before, where it starts to create barriers of needing stakeholder approval for the smallest things without kind of getting out of the gate. So that's what you're trying to avoid. So how do you gauge that? As with anything. So if you're building a venture building factory, it's like a venture, right? So it's an iterative process. So you start from the best possible foundations that you can muster, and then you get going and make sure you're constantly monitoring it with the right feedback loops, and you iterate on it. You double down on what's working, and you iron out the kinks. I know I'm making it sound really simple, by the way. It's really not, but that really is the best way forward.
A lot of these things tend to be simple, but by far definitely not easy to implement, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think, again, and one thing I talk about quite often is not falling into the trap of slavishly following a particular process or framework, be it service design, be it lean design method, whatever the framework is. Everybody loves a good framework. And that's where consultants make so much money as well. They go, we've got the next best framework. And they can be extremely helpful in providing guidance and parameters, etc. And they can provide a lot of comfort. But again, the danger there is that you follow it too slavishly. Venture building is the best way to see it is like a flow of calculated entrepreneurship. There is going to be a certain amount of chaos in that, but also sufficient science and measurement to get you to where you should go if it's done properly, right? So I always say, it might look chaotic, but there is method to the madness. But you're going to have to get comfortable with a certain degree of madness. So, yeah.
And maybe now looking more from the perspective of an individual. So if you put yourself in the shoes of a professional innovator, so someone who's part of a big company, what advice would you give to them if they're in a position where they feel, well, there's maybe too much chaos here, or they don't feel they're getting much progress? There's an obvious route, which is to just leave that company and maybe join another one that gets it better, or they might want to go off and start their own venture. If you were their career coach or advisor on a personal level, what would you urge them to consider?
Yeah, and it's really on a case-by-case basis, and I also really don't purport to have all the answers. But what I would say is, when it comes to navigating through the chaos, your guiding light there is making sure you're collecting the right metrics, and you're ensuring that you've got the right feedback back loops in place, that you're at least gathering the right learnings, right? And then, as long as you're communicating properly and regularly to correct stakeholders and bringing them along the journey, it should be easier. The other thing that I would, and this might sound like a biased answer, but okay, I'm gonna use a weird analogy, so bear with me.
Go for it.
Have you got children?
Yes, 2.
Yeah. So do you remember what it was like being a first-time parent?
Yep.
Yeah.
David even more recently.
Yeah. Oh, congratulations.
Thank you.
I remember it like it was yesterday, and it can be quite stressful because it's your first time as a parent, and baby's very vulnerable, and I remember sitting in A&E when my baby had her first major temperature, and A&E is full of first-time parents, very anxious first-time parents, and slightly bemused medical staff. And that's, but that just is what it is. And the reason for that is not having the experience, right? Not understanding, like, when a cry is just a cry for attention, or a cry is because the baby is genuinely in distress. And then when you come to your second baby, you tend to be a bit more chilled out. And when it comes to the third or fourth, whatever, I'm the oldest child of 4. And I remember feeling really annoyed that I had a really hard time. And then my third and fourth sibling had such an easy time with my parents. And they probably would massively disagree with that, by the way, as would my parents. But you understand the comparison. And so what I'm trying to get at is, if you're an innovator within a corporate, and again, you might have loads of background in corporate innovation, but maybe not so much. You may not have had the experience of building a venture in the wild, or building ventures full stop. And that doesn't mean that you're not capable of doing it. Absolutely not. But it will help getting on board or working with someone who has done it a few times. And the reason for that is that they have a better understanding or instinct as to, okay, here are the things that you should focus on, and here are the things you don't need to focus on. We don't need to slavishly follow every single step of this process. Here are the steps that I would recommend, and here are the ones that you can ignore, or having a really gut feel for, now we should pivot, now we shouldn't, or even to help make that really hard decision of, okay, this project's going nowhere and we need to kill it, right? So getting that extra.
I think that's a fantastic analogy, and I would describe it also as a signal versus noise instinct, that someone who's able to tell apart, okay, what are really essential, significant signals that are occurring, versus, oh, okay, there's a bad review on Facebook or something like that. It's not the end of the world, or someone said they disagreed with our idea somewhere in the organization. It's really not worth getting too worried about.
Yeah.
Let's focus a little bit more on yourself, Becky. Could you tell us a bit about what you offer to companies or individuals?
So it's kind of that. So my background is both corporate and building startups. So I started off my career working in probably the most hierarchical kind of organization you can work in, which is a law firm. Then I quit that to build startups for about a decade, and then I went back into corporate to build ventures from within, and now I consult in that. And so I always say my biggest asset is all the myriad of mistakes I've made, right? And they're not failures, they're learnings, and they are my biggest asset. And so I work with a consultancy called New 21. And we are a small band of experienced entrepreneurs and innovators. And so we focus on things like building cultures of innovation and building ventures, new products, and that sort of thing. So it's exactly, again, using that slightly weird analogy, we're all, we've popped out a few children, put it that way. And that's kind of what I focus on. So I focus on helping corporate innovation units build ventures, and also, most importantly, scale, because there's often too much emphasis on getting to MVP. Actually, the hard part is getting from MVP to product market fit and scale. We often talk about the concept of getting through the valley of death. That is where the graveyard of startups lies. And so, focus on helping
and of innovation departments as well.
Correct. Yeah, correct.
If a listener would like to get in touch with you, whether it's to employ your services, or maybe they're looking for a job themselves in that field as well, how should anyone reach out to you best?
So good place to start is LinkedIn. New 21 is new21.com. Actually, really exciting. We're about to launch our new website and brand, which includes our venture building services. So head to that website, or my LinkedIn are two pretty good places to start.
Great. We'll put a link to both of those in the description of this podcast. So we'll invite listeners to check those out. So it's time for us to wrap up now, Becky. I want to say a huge thank you to you for joining us today. I've really enjoyed discussing this with you. I recognize so much of what you said, and you brought some fantastic new insights and fun analogies along as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been really fun.
Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this episode of the Culture Edge podcast. As you heard just now, our guests are a highly diverse group of entrepreneurs and innovators, each with fantastic experience in both the corporate world and the startup world. So subscribe to the Culture Edge podcast today and join us again for more practical advice for your career and your impact in innovation.